So once again, good morning everyone. We will get started as everyone's grabbing their seats. May we request everyone to please be seated. We know how hard it is to leave a good coffee break, but we also don't want to delay you for lunch, so we will start. Once again, good morning everyone and welcome back to Plenary Session 1. My name is Palak Rawal. I work as a social development specialist with the Asian Development Bank, supporting some of our integrated livelihoods programs, and I'll be moderating this session. In the opening session this morning, we heard powerful stories about how climate change is reshaping livelihoods for communities and how communities are responding to it, not just as participants, but as active partners. This plenary session will focus on individual and household level climate resilience. How can livelihood programs be designed to better support the poorest and most vulnerable households to build long-term resilience? We'll explore integrated approaches that link social protection, financial inclusion, skills development, employment generation, and climate awareness services into integrated packages. We will start with a scene-setting presentation, which will be followed by an exciting panel discussion, and then we'll open up the floor to your insights and questions. So we would request through this presentation and panel discussion, please keep taking your notes for anything you'd like to share towards the end, as we will try to leave as much time as possible for an audience interaction and Q&A. With that, let me begin by introducing our first speaker. Our first presenter is Bob Babajanian, Senior Social Development Specialist at the Asian Development Bank, specializing in social protection. Prior to joining ADB, Bob has also worked with the ODI Global, the World Bank, and as a lecturer at the London School of Economics. Bob will provide insights on how ADB is supporting integrated livelihood approaches across the region. Please join me in welcoming Bob Babajanian.
Thank you very much, Palak. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. In the next 10 minutes, I will discuss how integrated livelihoods approaches can build individual and household resilience. In this presentation, I'm drawing on thinking across a technical assistance project on inclusive and resilient social protection that has been supported by ADB and has also been supported by CRPP. So this work has been supported by a number of excellent partners and excellent researchers, and I hope in this presentation I'm doing justice to their work by summarizing their findings and reflections from this work. So let's define the terms first. By livelihoods, we're referring to capabilities, assets, and activities required to make a living. So this is a seminal definition from a study by Robert Chambers and Tim Conway in 1992. By climate resilient livelihoods, we mean livelihoods that are able to anticipate, absorb, adapt, and transform in response to climate shocks and stresses, while maintaining an improved level of well-being for poor and vulnerable households. Now, this three A's plus T framework you may be familiar with, but we think it's very important in identifying key resilience dimensions that have implications for programming and policy making. Now, what do we mean by integrated? This is simply about combining or coordinating separate elements to produce a more effective and harmonious whole. So if you combine all these elements, and respond to the question of how do you actually build individual and household resilience through integrated livelihoods approaches, then you have two key ingredients here. One is about coordinating across the resilience dimensions, the three A's plus T. And second, by coordinating across different sectors, organizations, programs, and activities. Now, you would notice that I also have an overburdened Christmas tree there. And the key point here is that when we talk about integration, we don't mean just combining multiple things into one program, but it's about careful, meaningful design that actually coordinates various ingredients to make a whole that can actually work. So with that in mind, let me move on to my main slide. So this is where we try to put together a kind of a typology on resilient livelihoods. And you can see at the bottom there, I've outlined all the 4 resilience dimensions. And let's just go one by one. So the first one is about anticipatory action. This is what we're quite familiar with this. It incorporates a number of various modalities, including early warning systems, assistance to farmers, other groups, evacuation support. The key thing about this particular modality that this is about support towards better livelihood. So it's not just about supporting well-being, but it has a very focused design that focuses on livelihoods. And a good program to mention here is the Mongolia Anticipatory Assistance to Herders, that has actually protected many of them from harsh winters and has shown great results. Now, let's move to the second one, which is about livelihoods protection when a shock occurs. So these two, anticipate and absorb, are about actions when shocks occur. One is in anticipation, the other one when it's already in place. So here, we are familiar with shock-responsive measures, shock-responsive social protection, but again, when it comes to livelihoods, these are sets of measures that deal with specific aspects related to livelihoods, for example, providing climate risk insurance, affordable health, shelter housing, and so on. An example here is support given to Pakistan after the floods in 2022. So ADB has provided a number of, has designed and helped Pakistan with a number of projects that focused on both emergency rehabilitation, but also help to rehabilitate housing and community assets. Now, let's move to the third set, and this is the largest set of resilience interventions that focuses on adaptation. And adaptation is absolutely crucial for ensuring that livelihoods are supported, maintained, and enhanced. So the main modality that we know of is the asset transfer cash plus approach, which is often referred to as poverty graduation programs. And there are variation of different programs in over 160 countries in the world. The ADB is supporting 12 graduation programs in Asia. And these programs they primarily were developed to support livelihoods and to ensure that individuals can access key inputs, productive resources, opportunities, and by providing a comprehensive bundle of services and support measures. Now, what is different about the sort of resilient livelihoods approach here is that it intentionally links these livelihood programs with the climate dimension, climate risks, and the design incorporates climate from the very beginning. Now, another subset of programs that deal with resilient livelihoods is about community infrastructure development. And we specifically identify this block of programs as a key ingredient here because what literature shows is that individual and household level resilience building should be very much connected and linked with community level activities that provide infrastructure and facilities that people can draw on. So here we have a number of good programs we can talk about. So the Sustainable Livelihoods Program in the Philippines, or the Padayon program, is the graduation program supported by ADB. It incorporates an explicit resilience dimension. The Logic program in Bangladesh is very successful. It's been supported by UNDP and the European Union, and it combines individual level support with community-driven infrastructure development. Now, moving on to the third block, here we're discussing a number of programs that bordering with transformative action. So here are the programs that deal with ecosystem restoration, environmental conservation, and they're linked to social protection and labor market initiatives, and therefore we categorize them in this continuum of programs. One important modality here is green public works, and the Indian MGNREGA is known as a program that combines social assistance with supporting investments in important environmentally significant infrastructure. The program in China is a very interesting program in that it attempts to move people away from commercial logging into environmentally friendly activities by providing environmental subsidies, but also training and retraining commercial loggers and moving away towards sort of green jobs, green transition. And therefore, we think that these are the kind of programs that can be even classed as transformative, potentially. And then finally, there are programs that deal with mitigation. So these are programs that almost a last resort measures that deal with situations where living in areas that have been impacted by disasters is no longer tenable, and some resettlement and relocation is necessary. So, for example, the program in Fiji, it's a government legislated program that has planned climate relocation when it's strictly necessary. So this is the sort of the overall framework, and I try to use examples where it's relevant, but there are many more other examples that we've identified through our review. Now, what I'll do in the next 2 minutes is to really try to highlight some of the benefits that we've identified through our review. And I put an asterisk there, and I specifically intentionally use the word potential, because what we realized is that when it comes to identifying and understanding the impact of climate resilience livelihood approaches, is that a lot of them are new, and so there is no sort of consolidated and strong body of evidence that can pinpoint to some strong results. And this is because some programs are new, but other programs, they also have poor tracking systems. From the studies that we've looked at, and that actually had more rigorous way of monitoring results, we identified a number of positive benefits. First, at the micro level, individual and household level. So here we saw a definite shift towards productive and diverse livelihoods. But we also saw that the livelihoods get better protected and they're more resilient. And this second aspect is very important, because livelihood programs themselves, they can actually enhance livelihoods and they can promote productivity and income. But with resilience dimension coming in, what we see is that incomes become stable, the coping strategies are no longer negative, the damage to assets is less, indebtedness is less. So the second component is the true dimension of resilient livelihoods that is supported through these programs. We also saw results at the macro level. So here, there's obviously support for human development outcomes through improved livelihoods and better income and ability to consume not just food and nutrition, but also health, healthcare, and so on, education. We also saw support for environmental targets, as well as broader economic goals, such as cost effectiveness and strengthened economic productivity. One thing to note here, again, is that we also saw some programs with mixed results, and this was the case where the climate resilience was not fully integrated into program design. It was more like an afterthought. The actual program was not conceived with climate resilience in mind. These were interventions that were added to livelihood programs at a later stage. So in these programs, for example, you saw enhanced livelihoods, but we didn't see much in terms of the stability and maintenance of these livelihoods when shocks occurred. Now, in my final slide, let me talk about three main lessons that we think are important. There are many other lessons, but these are crucial to bear in mind when designing and implementing these programs. One, as I mentioned, climate resilience cannot be just an afterthought. So it's important that consideration of climate risks is systematically integrated into design and delivery, and also into the overarching livelihoods and sector policies that facilitate high-level coordination and capacity and expertise. Second, what we thought that we saw from the review and our analytical work is that the best resilience outcomes occur when there is an effort to think through all 4 resilience pathways. So there is a continuum of support that is given to people from anticipation, shock responsiveness, adaptation, and hopefully green transition. So this is important because you can support people in terms of adaptation activities, for example. But the question is, what would happen to their assets when disaster strikes? That means that their anticipatory action should also be in place, and shock responsive measures should also be in place to ensure that the gains that individuals and households make are sustained. In other words, it's challenging, but it's important to keep in mind that only one ingredient on its own may not necessarily be enough to achieve effective resilience. And then finally, we're talking about scaling up, and this is extremely important. But one thing to remember here is that we need to keep in mind that climate risks are location-specific, and they're related to specific market conditions when it comes to livelihoods. But they're also people's needs, and individuals are different in terms of their social characteristics and their personal identity markers. So it's important to keep in place all the diversity of situations and the differences in people's risks and insecurities, and try to incorporate in programming in policy when you actually scale up those programs. And obviously the issue of inclusion is absolutely fundamental here. I didn't talk about it during the presentation, but to ensure that gender and social inequalities are appropriately reflected in design implementation is crucial. And that's yet another feature that needs to be factored in when designing these programs with the objective of ensuring inclusion and effective resilience. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our panel discussion in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, for providing us this very comprehensive framework, but also for drawing lessons on the design, delivery, and evidence, or sometimes the lack of it, from our programs across the region. We will now explore these themes further with a panel discussion, drawing on perspectives from the government, implementation and policy makers, development partners, and global climate finance. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists and request them to come up on stage one by one. First, I'd like to introduce Ms. Monina Romaldes, who is the Undersecretary for Operations at the Department of Social Welfare and Development in the Government of Philippines. Prior experience as Regional Director of the department with a long history of public service. Second, I'd like to request Ms. Ume Firdausi, who is the Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in the Government of Bangladesh, where she is involved in the planning and policy coordination for national environmental protection and adaptation. Third, I'd like to re-invite on stage Thoma Gone, who is the Task Team Leader for South and Southeast Asia at the AFD. He has more than 30 years of experience as an emergency and development practitioner in fragile states and emerging countries. Fourth, I'd like to call upon on stage Mr. Samik Adhikari. He's a senior economist in the Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice at the World Bank Group, with over a decade of experience working at the intersection of social protection, labor markets, and international migration. And last but not the least, I would like to request Mr. Yusuke Taishi, who serves as the Head of Adaptation and is the Senior Technical Advisor for UNDP's work on climate change adaptation. He oversees UNDP's climate change adaptation portfolio, responsible for programming worth $1.4 billion across 65 countries. Thank you so much, and I welcome all the panelists and request them to please take their seats. Building on the presentation made by Bob, some of the broader themes that we will explore in this panel discussion are how social safety nets can be better linked with livelihood support to go beyond short-term recovery and look at building long-term resilience of individuals and households. What mix of programs and interventions is most suited to support climate resilient livelihoods for the poorest and most climate vulnerable households? And how can integrated programs reach those most marginalized in the community, including women and informal workers, to build climate resilient livelihoods? With this, I'd now like to start our panel discussion. We would first like to hear from the government's perspective as policy makers and implementers. So if I may call upon Ms. Rumaldes to please answer first. We know that the Philippines has extensive experience in designing and delivering national social protection programs, such as the conditional cash transfer program like the 4Ps, and sustainable livelihoods initiatives, which were also highlighted in the presentation earlier, aimed at strengthening household resilience. So from the government's perspective, especially DSWD, what key benefits have been documented from these types of programs, both in terms of climate resilience outcomes and the broader socio-economic impacts at the community level? Please.
So good day to, of course, my fellow panelists and development partners in resilience. So on behalf of the Department of Social Welfare and Development of the Philippines, the government's lead agency for social protection and poverty reduction, I am honored to share our documented experience in building resilient and inclusive communities. As a country on the climate front lines, resilience is not optional. It, for us, is very essential. By strengthening individual and household climate resilience through integrated livelihood approaches and social protection, we empower Filipino families to withstand shocks, recover stronger, and secure sustainable futures. To advance this goal, DSWD implements key programs, projects, and activities such as 1. The Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino Program, or what we call the 4Ps, the government's flagship social protection program that provides conditional cash transfers to improve health, education, and nutrition outcomes among poor households. Number 2, we have the Sustainable Livelihood Program, as mentioned earlier, which builds the capacity of vulnerable families to develop stable income-generating activities. And third, we have the Kalahi Seeds program that uses community-driven development platforms that support climate-resilient investments and enterprise development, and as well as improved access to productive and resilience infrastructure, which is now broadened into the new project under the Philippine Community Resilience Project, or what we call the PCRP, which further integrates the climate adaptation and resilience, building into community investments and livelihood support. The 3 programs utilize a common and targeting mechanism to ensure that interventions effectively reach vulnerable and marginalized households and communities. At the local level, implementation is carried out through a convergent, integrated, and multi-sectoral approach to maximize impact and avoid duplication of efforts. Our SLP focuses on building the capacities of individuals and communities by improving access to seed capitals and markets, enhancing employability skills, promoting financial literacy, and savings mobilization, and of course, supporting enterprise development. All these efforts will be complemented by Kalahi Seeds, primarily through the implementation of its new project. The PCRP will provide grant support for resilience livelihoods, These programs also strengthen collaboration among community members and between communities and the respective LGUs, or what we call the local governments. Moreover, the program actively mobilizes communities and local governments to work together in strengthening their adaptive capacities and reducing vulnerabilities to climate-related risks, therefore fostering more coordinated and sustainable resilience-building efforts. The DSWD affirms that social protection anchors resilience. By integrating climate adaptation, sustainable livelihood, and community-driven approaches, we strengthen households through, of course, the 4Ps. We safeguard development gains through the Sustainable Livelihood Program, or what we call SLP, and empower communities to thrive despite climate risks or with the kalahisids, of course. In closing, our message is simple. Individual resilience is built through coordinated systems. Then, we link social protection with community empowerment and risk-informed planning. We do more than just help families survive a storm. We enable them to adapt, compete, and thrive in changing climate conditions. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yusik Romaldes. I think you captured the essence of a lot of key messages that we hope this session can provide. The most important being that resilience is not optional, it is mandatory. There is a combination of programs that are required to build resilience spanning across conditional cash transfer, livelihood development, and community-driven development programs, as well as the importance of targeting, convergence, integration, and how these can be anchored through coordinated social protection initiatives. Next, I'd like to request Ms. Firdausi to please share, as we heard in the opening session as well, Bangladesh has a national framework and action plan on locally led adaptation, which highlights social protection and health as core systems for scaling locally led adaptation. With this context, how can these systems be used in practice to support climate resilient livelihoods? And what key institutional, financing, or coordination factors you think are most critical to make this approach work on the ground?
Hello. Welcome and very good morning to all on behalf of Bangladesh. Thank you for your very important question. Very recently the National Framework and Action Plan for LLA in Bangladesh approved in the cabinet in the 15th May 2026. 25, and it is launched. That is very recently from 20th February in this year. It is very exciting for me. Actually, in Bangladesh National Framework and Action Plan on Locally Led Adaptation recognize that climate adaptation cannot be separated from people's everyday realities. Social protection and health system are not just safety nets. They are powerful delivering platform for building climate resilient livelihoods. Bangladesh already has extensive social protection program, including cash transfer, public works, livelihoods grants, and disaster response mechanism. These can be climate smart led by climate responsive cash transfer, public works for climate adaptation, livelihood diversification support, shock responsive safety nets. Using health system to strengthen climate resilient livelihood, there are climate resilient health infrastructure, disease surveillance linked to climate data, community health and nutrition program, health insurance, and financial risk protection. According to the framework, in Bangladesh. The implementation of LLA framework will be led by the government with the objective of enhancing the capacity of vulnerable communities, local government institutions, and civil society organizations for planning and financing climate change adaptation. Solution scaling up LLA will be through government system from the local to national level. This will be supported and facilitated by the social and economic sector, including uh, including ecosystem and environmental management and social protection. An enabling environment will also be put in place to strengthen climate adaptation by the private sector, cooperatives, producer groups, CSO, and non-government organization and community groups that includes women, men, youth person with disability, ethnic groups, and indigenous people, irrespective of sex and religions. Two high-level functions are critical to the LLA framework. These are scaling up LLA through the government system, and another one, strengthening and enabling the local people, organizations, and businesses involved in LLA. The framework are planning and finance, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, capacity building, and training, and research and development. To support the climate resilient livelihood, that is there are institutional financing and coordination factors that are most critical to make the approach or work in the ground level. That is institutional silos, weak local delivery capacity, static poverty targeting system, geographic isolation, social exclusion, short-term financing, urban informality, limited local access to climate change. Government of Bangladesh has been implemented to address these all challenges. Under the we are implementing a number of projects to address the climate change livelihood under the leadership of the Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary Firdausi. A lot of the key messages that you highlighted is really looking at social protection and health beyond safety nets, but looking at them as core delivery mechanisms for transformative impact. How important it is to have a comprehensive and integrated policy framework, and including some very key aspects which make it more comprehensive, such as linking to climate data, also linking to community resilient and climate resilient infrastructure, the role of CSOs and local organizations in planning, both at the individual and household level as well as at the community level, and we'll hear more about that tomorrow, and the diversity of groups that actually need to be taken into account to build community resilience. So thank you again. I would now like to hear from the perspective of climate finance and development partners. Thoma, if we may call upon you, drawing on your wide-ranging experience working in social protection and health, what do you think are the key metrics that are most useful for measuring and understanding the impacts of social protection programs on building resilience among poor and climate vulnerable households? Thoma, please.
Thank you, Balak, for the question. To measure and understand the impact of social protection programs on resilience among poor and vulnerable households, it's important to track indicators that reflect not only the income supports, but also households' capacity, and I will quote what Bob said earlier, households' capacity to anticipate, to absorb, to adapt, and to transform in the face of the shocks. And these indicators can be grouped into 5 key categories. First one would be the economic and financial resilience indicators. This measures households' ability to maintain or restore the livelihoods during the shocks, looking at income stability, consumption's smoothing capacity, assets ownership and diversification, access to credit and financial services, and expenditures patterns. Second category will be the food and nutrition security indicators, because social protection programs often aim to strengthen food security. Monitoring these indicators is quite essential. So we look at frequency and severity of food insecurity, the dietary diversity score, the meal frequency and caloric intake, and the use of negative coping strategies. Then we could look at the shock coping and adaptive capacity indicators. This reflects how households respond to and manage the shocks, the use of formal and informal safety nets, the diversification of income sources, the shocks preparedness, migration and remittance patterns. Then we can look at the social and human capital indicators. The resilience also depends on social and human dimensions, such as education level, school attendance, the health outcomes, especially the morbidity rates, access to healthcare, the nutritional status, the participation in community organizations, social networks providing support during shocks, which is quite an important mechanism, and finally, not the least one, but the important one, the gender inclusion, women's decision-making power, their access to resources and protection. And finally, I will look at an overall indicator, which is the program-specific and outcome, this direct access program effectiveness, looking at the coverage and targeting accuracy, the timelineliness of and predictability of benefits, the adequacy of assistance, and the behavioral change that can be observed in terms of investment in productive assets, adoption of climate smart practices, or risk reduction measures. I would say a few words on the role of the social protection in climate adaptation. Social protection is a key lever for adaptation, particularly for population most exposed to climate shocks, smallholder farmers, informal workers, women, and remote rural communities. It does enable protection of income and livelihoods during shocks. It does contribute also to the prevention of negative coping strategies. But social protection systems can be designed to integrate local specificities, the cash transfers, expanded coverage, and insurance mechanisms. They are more effective when they are based on territorial diagnostics of climate vulnerabilities and participatory mechanisms. So so-called adaptive social protection allows, for example, adjustment to eligible criteria, the benefits levels, or payment schedules in response to drought, floods, or cyclones. But in doing so, it does strengthen the anticipation and response capacity, anticipation and response capacity of national systems.
Thank you so much, Thama, for really directly also responding to a gap highlighted in the scene setting presentation, which is often the lack of data or tracking outcomes at the household level to really measure resilience. And you very clearly highlighted indicators spanning the 5 categories which can be used to measure household capacity and resilience, including economic, food security, coping, human and social capital, gender and inclusion, and also assessing program impact. And with these types of indicators and data, how we can build more evidence over time to measure climate resilience. So thank you for sharing that, Thoma. If I may pass it on to Samik. Now, we know that the World Bank supports social protection and livelihoods initiatives globally to strengthen resilience at both the household and community level, often within broader poverty reduction programs like economic inclusion or poverty graduation, as we often call it. Based on your experience, what are some of the key lessons emerging from this work, particularly around achieving scale, mobilizing sustainable financing, and institutionalizing bottom-up decision-making through these programs? Over to you, Samik.
Thank you, Bala. Good morning, everyone. My name is Samik Adhikari. I'm a senior economist with the World Bank, based here in Bangkok. So I'm going to talk in very specific terms about a particular kind of social protection program, which at the World Bank we call it economic inclusion programs, and at the ADB I understand from Palak, poverty graduation programs. But over the last 5 years or so, we've really amped up our efforts in terms of cataloging evidence from these programs around the world. So there's been 2 rounds of publications produced over the last 5 years, one in 2021 and one in 2024, so really highlighting some of the features, the impacts, and the coverage details of this program through the State of the Economic Inclusion Report. And I'm going to sort of present a couple of insights, 3 in particular, to address the questions that Palak posed. So the first insight is from these programs is that even when these programs are not explicitly designed with a climate objective in mind, they're still supporting climate vulnerable places and help households avoid negative coping, as Thomas was mentioning. Now, if you imagine a map of the world, and if you overlay some of the most climate vulnerable places with also the places where these economic inclusion programs are, what you'll find is that there is significant amount of overlaps already in terms of where these programs operate. And because of this heavy overlap between the EI programs and climate vulnerability, one of the ways in which these programs are helping households adapt is by avoiding negative coping mechanism. Now, in social protection literature, we often highlight how social protection and safety net programs avoid erosion of human capital because it prevents a scenario where households have to take children out of school or skip a health visit because of not having enough resources. So one could think of the climate channel or the resilience channel in a similar way as well, where you're avoiding negative coping mechanisms with related to your surroundings. Right? So that's the first insight. The second is that when climate objectives and resilience is specifically incorporated in some of these economic inclusion programs by design, what we're learning is that there are some very promising innovations that are emerging, but we need more causal evidence in this regard. So in Bob's presentation, he mentioned about anticipatory cash transfers. Now, cash transfers are included in over half of these 90 or so economic inclusion programs that are cataloged in the 2024 report. And it's one of the critical component of poverty graduation programs. But there is some very interesting evidence coming out of Nigeria, Northeast Nigeria, that when these transfers in climate vulnerable places are anticipatory and provided together with some information on sort of climate early action data, it actually does help household cope better to shocks than in a scenario where these transfers are provided after a shock has occurred, right? So I found that very interesting. Similarly, if we look at many of these economic inclusion programs, over 90% of these programs have a component on skills training. And so another sort of approach through which these programs, at least in some of the places, are providing resilience to households is by helping them, providing them skills training in areas where they don't have to sort of degrade the environment. So there are a couple of cases in Africa, in Benin and Ivory Coast, where households who are relying on deforestation for livelihoods, for example, were provided skills training in areas such as beekeeping and mushroom production, which are much more sort of friendly. And then finally, the third point that I'd like to mention when it comes to the insight, and especially to address the point about scaling and financing, is that to achieve the scale, what the report highlights is many of the existing programs are already relying on national level sort of government-led systems, right? And I think that's sort of the path to scale as well. They're also building on existing social protection programs which have been operating over the last couple of decades in some instances. And in terms of financing, there are promising models which sort of combine government, donor, and philanthropic financing. A case in point here is the Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Programs, which has not only helped reach some of these economic inclusion programs to more than 500,000 households, but also provided some vital evidence base around these programs. And if you look at some of the recent evaluations coming out of Niger and other places, I think they're shedding very important insights on these programs. And finally, many of these EI programs also leverage community-based structures. In fact, more than 1/3 of these programs that are cataloged in the 2024 report have community groups as partners in delivery of these programs. And so it's important to continue leveraging on these structures, which not only supports community buy-in, but also peer learning in many instances. So I'd like to stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Samik, for the very insightful remarks, especially drawing on the evidence and knowledge base that we have, specifically focusing on integrated approaches like the economic inclusion or poverty graduation programs, as we call them, both when they're supporting resilience as integrated programs in themselves, but also when explicitly they can further resilience through their design and delivery with actions like anticipatory cash transfers, integrating with community-based structures, and the key message that these programs, while being so comprehensive, don't operate in isolation. They mostly build on to existing government programs and schemes, and the key is to identify those entry points and bundle the right services and opportunities for the target group with them. So thank you once again, Samik. If I may turn it over to Yusuke now. As we know, UNDP also works across many country contexts to integrate social protection, livelihoods, and climate adaptation. From your global experience working across multiple countries, what do you see as the critical factors that enable these types of programs to deliver sustained climate resilience for the poorest and most climate vulnerable households?
First of all, thank you for inviting UNDP to this forum. To respond to your question, I'll highlight three factors that matter most. First is risk-informed planning. When designing livelihood programs, it must be based on climate risk analytics. If your countries do not have granular risk analytics, I suggest looking at 5 key climate hazards, 5+1, floods, drought, storms, heat waves, wildfires, and sea level rise depending on where you live. So these are 5+1 key climate hazards. You want to look at how these hazards are projected to change in next 20, 30 years. Rise in temperature, future rise in temperature is already baked in the system in the next 20, 30 years. So that means if we fail to integrate climate risks in asset, crop, enterprise, support system, it means you're failing, you're locking in vulnerability into future. So climate risk informed design is the first factor, I think that's critical. Second is layered support. Resilience building is cumulative. So we need to design sequenced packages of services that are aligned with the general progression of people's resilience building, which typically moves from stabilization, asset creation, market integration, and risk financing. So designing sequenced services along that projection is important. And lastly, institutional anchoring. When designing social programs, livelihood programs, they must sit inside national social protection systems, local government planning, or sectoral strategies. If these programs operate as standalone programs, resilience will disappear once the funding cycles end. So these are three key factors that I want to highlight. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yusuke. I think that is a very, very comprehensive approach. And these three factors have come up also in discussions, but I think just laying them out in terms of design and diagnostics, taking into account risk-informed planning, the delivery and the bundle of services being layered and sequenced, and institutional and policy level integration, which comes out very strongly as critical factors. So thank you all for the very rich insights. I would now like to open the floor. We have about nearly 20 minutes for audience comments, questions, as well as any insights that you'd like to share. When you do speak, I would request you to state your name and organization. And if you could please keep your comments brief so that we can hear from more of you in the room, and indicate if your question is to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. I see one hand is already up. We have 2 mics in the room, so we would request you to please go to the mics and line up. Please. Yes. And others, as you're thinking of your questions, please feel free to take the slot behind the microphones.
Thank you for sharing. I'm Olis from Wahid Foundation Indonesia. I just want to share in Indonesia context we see a tension between the survival-driven livelihood and long-term climate resilience. For example, based on our experience when we assist the community in the local level, it's like a farmer often choose short-term crops that degrade ecosystem due to immediate economic pressure. And our experience show that community-owned cooperative system ensure collective ownership and social capital. However, the struggle to meet investment government standard, and my question is, how can the climate finance framework adapt to accommodate hybrid community enterprise model? And the second question I will give to Madam from the Bangladesh. And congrats for your national framework development. And what are the main barriers to integration and to reaching the poorest and the most climate vulnerable in your experience? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will take one more question or one more person from the audience and then pass it on to the panelists, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Talha Manzoor Rana, and I am from Government of Pakistan, Ministry of Economic Affairs. I deal with ADB over there. So my question is, in targeting the most marginalized groups, how do we prevent the climate responsive cash programs from excluding those who are informal, mobile or outside formal registries? Thank you.
Thank you so much to our colleague from Pakistan. If I can summarize, we have broadly received 3 questions. So one is looking at moving from a survival-driven, or what we often term as short-term approach, to long-term livelihood options, and how can climate financing support the models that support community resilience in the long term. So that's one. Second is the main barriers to reaching the poorest and most vulnerable households. And third is how do we deal with exclusion challenges which are very real in country context, even with the best effort of trying to reach the most marginalized groups. So we know that one of the questions which is on the main barriers to reaching the poorest and most vulnerable is directed towards Deputy Secretary Firdausi. So if we can start with you, until then I'll request other panelists to also gather their thoughts and let us know who'd like to go. Please, Ms. Firdausi first.
Thank you. Thank you for a nice question. Actually, in my experience working in the climate adaptation and social development in Bangladesh, the barriers to integration and to reaching the poorest and most vulnerable climate groups are really technical. Their individual, financial, social potential, the most persistent challenges are fragmented institutional and silos programming, weak local government capacity, difficult to identify the climate vulnerable, poor, and the too outdated data that is list of the beneficiaries, exclusion errors in social safety nets, mobile and displaced population. Geographic isolation is and infrastructure gap is the important challenge for this. Gender and social norms constant, you know, in our country. Most of people are that is practiced in Muslim, and they feel shy, and they are not very much updated about the advanced technology. So another is short-term project cycle versus long-term climate risk. Urban climate and poverty disconnected. That is, there is a disconnection between urban climates and poverty. So finance does not flow the last miles. That is to the core people. Yes, we have financing, but it is lack of to reach the core people. Gaps in the data and evidence, it is very important in our country, because we have a lot of data, but they are not updated. So we need to update it to take appropriate adoption planning and appropriate program. So it is very important. So thanks again for this.
Thank you so much. If other panelists who may like to add to this or to respond to some of the other questions that have come up. Any volunteers? Please, Samik.
Thank you for the questions. Maybe I can touch briefly on the first and the third question. The first question, which is on the tension between the short term and the long term. Within the context of economic inclusion programs in particular, I think one of the ways in which design elements have tended to address this is also by instilling this component of regular cash transfers within the bundle of interventions that are provided for economic inclusion, and the rationale there is exactly that, right? Where it's a collective action problem in the sense that what might be beneficial in the long term for the households and the communities, in the short term, the households might be thinking more about sort of individual needs from their side. I'm sure there is sort of evidence on programs and experiments that have compared what happens when you integrate cash transfers versus you don't. In Sierra Leone, we were trying to sort of institute an experiment leveraging on government's existing safety net program, where we were, but the results are not out yet. We've just finished the baseline. So perhaps if other panelists know of evidence on this, it'll be interesting to hear. And on the third question on I think it's a very good question, and I think the question was quintessential during COVID when, it was the kind of shock that did not affect, or at least in the beginning did not affect, the poorest, the most vulnerable that are in the social registries, but informal sector workers working in urban spaces in many cities around the world, right? So I think there's been a push now from the donor side, but also from the government side in terms of expanding these registries to also include groups that are traditionally might have been excluded in these registries. And I'm sure with the technological innovations that we're seeing these days, there are ways to probably leverage that as well. In Cambodia, where both Toma and I work, the assessment for the safety net program is actually done on site, so you can go and sort of ask for an assessment as a household, and the assessment is done there. So that might also be one way in which government try to circumvent this registry issue. But let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samik. Yusuke, you wanted to come in, and then Thoma, please.
Thank you. I'm going to respond to the question about how climate finance can respond to community needs. We all know that adaptation finance gap is massive. And because of this massive adaptation financing gap, there is emerging conversations, discussion about the need to unlock non-grant financing to address adaptation needs. But when we look at existing patterns, the way cost of capital is determined is overly punitive for developing countries. And when we look at SMEs or cooperatives in rural developing countries, it's even more so. It's not unusual to see 20–30% interest charged to these small, medium enterprises. So in immediate future, it's really difficult to address this market failure. I would call it market failure. And yes, there is emerging mechanisms of concessional blended finance, but still it's not really addressing the true needs that exist at the community level. And I would say, I would highlight the role of domestic financial institution, because they have a lot more flexibility in setting the rules in terms of access to finance for local customers. I think we need to focus a lot more on domestic finance institutions and what they can do, because I do not think their current products are often reflecting the needs, adaptation needs or climate-related needs of local communities.
Thank you so much, Yusuke. Thoma, you wanted to come in, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to say a word on the inclusion that was, question was raised about the most vulnerable. I think indeed the programs targeting of informal and rural workers, women, single parent households, elderlies, and people with disabilities is quite crucial. And it has to be particularly aligned with the resilience-focused approach. I guess that the key issue is to use registries that are clearly designed with indicators that address the most vulnerable people, to use a technology that allows today to develop the capacity to register and to monitor properly programs. The digitalization and the artificial intelligence are quite more and more being developed and used in this matter. But beyond the technology, it's very much a strong political willingness to move toward this inclusion that has to be demonstrated. And these groups are among the most exposed to climate shocks, and they are often inadequately covered by existing social protection systems. And I would say that the local approach allows for the adaptation of enrollments, contributions and benefits to the territorial realities, and while integrating social norms and gender inequalities have also to be included. And it's essential to avoid the adaptation that reproduce the inequalities and to strengthen the collective resilience. So I really consider that this inclusion issue is crucial in in trying to develop a proper adaptive project.
Thank you so much, Thoma. That's really, really insightful. We do have time for a couple of more questions. So, or even insights or experiences that you'd like to share from your countries, your programs, please use this opportunity as a platform to really have a very interactive discussion. So, anyone who'd like to go next, please, the microphone is right there.
Hello, my name is Suranjana. I'm from the Vairo Commission, and we are a global network of women's organizations. Thank you for this very interesting discussion. I think there's a lot of food for thought here. I particularly I appreciate all the frameworks which are talking about the different components of building more resilient livelihoods. I think I wanted to point to something which I feel needs to be elevated in this discussion, which is the work of grassroots women, both at household level and community level. We can call it the care work. We can name it, community safety nets. I'm not sure what the name is, but I think in the CRPP and going forward, I think it would be important to explicitly recognize the contribution of grassroots women in filling the gaps when programs don't reach the most vulnerable, and B, also sort of supporting delivery and helping to reach sometimes social protection programs or other kinds of programs supporting, working with governments to provide information and so on, developing the social registries and so on. So we have a lot of experience in, I think, from India, for example. We have the leader sitting here. Please do reach out to her and find out more about how they've worked on COVID, supporting individuals and families to get ID cards and access the social protection programs, providing food and shelter for the period before the payments actually came in. So there are a lot of these kinds of gaps, and unfortunately, the women's care work and the work of grassroots organizations remains in the realm of the informal and invisible. So I think it's important that they come into these frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for highlighting this absolutely essential element, which is critical to any discussions that we have on resilience from the perspective of care work, but also the representation and contribution of grassroots women and organizations. Maybe I'll check with our panelists if anyone would like to share any comments or insights based on that. If not, we also acknowledge it as a very critical element, and thank you so much for raising that once again. Any final questions, please? And this will be the last question from the audience.
Hi there, Sinead Walsh. I'm a new advisor to the CRPP. Really great to be here. I was doing a study recently on social protection programs in Africa, and I was really quite struck by Bob's presentation and the typology, because one finding of that program was that social protection programs that claimed to be adaptive were actually quite successful on the absorb, but not at all on the adapt and transform, that it was those longer term resilience capacities that weren't being built, including in the program in the Sahel that Samik mentioned. So I guess I'm curious for any of the panelists really whether this is replicated in social protection programs here in Asian countries that you know about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any panelists who would like to take a stab at this? Please. Okay, so we have two more, and then with that we will please go ahead first, and then we can have the quick comment and then summarize.
Good day, everyone. My name is Brian Kunai. I'm from Papua New Guinea. This is a question posed by my team from the Pacific. I think social protection is gaining momentum within the Pacific, and most governments within the Pacific are progressing policy and legislative reforms to adopt social protection in that space. And my question to the panel, for those countries that have already progressed social protection, especially in the Asia Pacific, what are some of the challenges and the risks that are associated with social protection, and how do we mitigate those risks, and also as countries and nations, how do we adapt from those risks, the possible challenges that, for Papua New Guinea, for instance, we have competing priorities within government. Social protection may not be a priority right now for government, which we have infrastructure development, other areas that health, education, other areas that may need and require government support, which will overlap the support that is warranted for social protection. So what are some of the mechanisms or some, what are some of the systems or some kind of approach that can be taken to mitigate those challenges? And from your experience as countries that have already practiced that.
Great. Thank you so much for our colleague from PNG. We are nearing the end of the session, although it looks like it has just gotten exciting and lively. So we'll take some of the questions into lunch, but I'll request the last two members of the audience to share their questions or comments very briefly so that we can then wrap up the session and take more during lunch. Please.
Okay. I just want to commend Undersecretary Romualdez for expanding lots of social safety nets in the Philippines. I stand here today as a product of 4-piece families. My mom is a 4-piece beneficiary for the past, before I entered college and got a scholarship in the US and studied there and returned to the Philippines and established a startup company. So I just want to commend the DSWD of the Philippines for not only expanding 4Ps, but adding certain programs that enable families like me, a farm boy, to be here in front of you because of that social safety net that they created. And now Madam Romualdez and their team are expanding it. So I just want to share that, yes, there are, we hear numbers, we hear narratives, but the most important things are stories of resilience from climate-devastated Philippines and other countries that leaders like in those areas of government, in DSWD, especially in the national government like Madam Romualdez, are doing so that we can have more young people like me who can speak here and be able to help more people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very, very inspiring note and for sharing your story, because there's nothing more powerful than the stories from the ground themselves. We'll go to the last member of the audience and then wrap up the session, please.
Thank you.
It's working.
Thank you very much. It's really honored to be speaking as last speaker. Especially this has been very, very useful. My name is Kunzang and I'm Global Lead with ICIMOT, International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. We serve our 8 regional member countries in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. So I just wanted to appreciate the kind of comprehensiveness and important, really deep diving into this very important session. And ICIMOT working from the grassroots until the policy, given its very interesting, useful, sacred mandate in the region. I really appreciate the points that's made by panelists, especially reflecting on Yusuke's point on the role of the domestic FIs. I also share with the point of previous comment saying that very keen to elevate this discussion further because it's important to further deep dive at the same time having all the relevant actors in the forum one way or the other. For instance, on the role of FIs, I acknowledge that, but we also need to have, for instance, the rules that the central banks, that the role where we can bring the central banks, the regulatory authority, which actually makes that those rules where the FIs can play those, the role within that flexibility. So recognizing that, ECMOT, we are convening the FIs, including central banks and policymakers, to make sure that there is this integration, ensuring that this engagement gets elevated. And one point that I want to appreciate when it comes to the assessment, social protection, inclusion, the role of the local government and the national government, because how much to include and on the ground assessment and that inclusion process is very, very important. So I want to really appreciate these 2 points. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your remarks. As the last member of the audience, unfortunately, we are nearing the end of our session, and this has been extremely productive and valuable. This is just the start. We will continue to explore these themes during lunch and after lunch. Sorry that we couldn't respond to all of the questions, but I'll request all of you to interact closely with the panelists during lunch, and we will continue to explore these themes. Before we close the session, I will try to quickly summarize some of the key takeaways from this rich discussion that we had over the last 75 minutes or so. So to me, there are 5 key points that really came out from this discussion. The first being the need to reimagine livelihood and social protection programs that are targeted at individuals and households to really address the intersection of poverty, climate risks, and promote long-term resilience, like we heard, not as an afterthought, but as a deliberate design and delivery mechanism, moving from short-term to long-term strategies, and we heard about the different types of interventions that can be used to support that. Second is the value of integration, layering, and sequencing, spanning across the types of interventions and programs. We heard examples from economic inclusion programs, we heard examples from other community-driven programs, and how this integration is key to work together to build coherent resilience at the household level. Third is the importance of risk-informed planning and diagnostics to inform the program design, delivery, as well as monitoring, and how that should be central to all programs. Fourth is institutional and policy level integration and change, including looking at the role of financial institutions domestically, internationally, but also looking at how we can institutionalize these changes. And fifth, and the last, is the value of data, evidence, indicators, measurement to really continuously inform these programs and knowledge across the region and the world. And lastly, something that was said at the beginning of the session is resilience at the individual and household level is not optional, but it's mandatory. On that note, we would like to really thank all of our panelists for the very rich discussion. May we please have a round of applause for all our panelists, as well as our presenter, our presenter, and to all of you for the very active participation. This afternoon, we will continue to explore these themes in our Spotlight sessions. Spotlight 1 will focus on adaptive social safety net programs, and Spotlight 2 will explore women's access to human and financial capital. Both sessions will run in parallel from 1:30 to 2:45 p.m. Please feel free to choose the session topic that is most relevant to you and your work. We will now break for lunch, which is served at the venue, and we would request you to be back for the Spotlight sessions at around 1:30. Thank you so much once again to our presenter, panelists, and to all of you. Thank you.